On the afternoon of the 24th of June, 1994, a crowd has gathered by the runway of the Fairchild Air Force Base in the state of Washington, in the United States. The group, a mix of United States Air Force personnel and their families, are here to watch a practice demonstration for the Fairchild Airshow, scheduled to take place the following day. Fresh in the minds of those present is a recent disturbing incident that had taken place at the airbase. An ex-Air Force serviceman had entered the hospital on the base and shot and killed 4 people. 2 of those people were doctors who had found the gunman unfit to continue military duty. The gunman was only stopped when he was shot and killed by security. The wing commander has taken the decision to continue with the airshow and the practice, believing it is important that the public see the airbase functioning as normal. The demonstration flight involves a Boeing B52 Stratofortress and a KC-135 aerial tanker performing a series of independent maneuvers in front of the crowd, who watch parallel to the runway with cameras and camcorders at the ready. You are listening to Inside the Black Box. This is the story of United States Air Force Czar 52.
Pull up! Pull up!
Although the demonstration was scheduled to take place in the morning, the display has been delayed due to the Secretary of State visiting the airbase as a consequence of the shooting. The demonstration is to be performed by aircraft of the 325th Bomb Squadron, which sits under the 92nd Bomb Wing. The squadron operates the strategic bomber, the Boeing B52 Stratofortress. Even in 1994, the B52 is a venerable aircraft, having been in operation since 1955. It is one of the most widely recognized aircraft in the world and a symbol of American military power. Despite only ever dropping conventional munitions in its operational history, which included the Vietnam War and the First Gulf War, the B-52 was the backbone of Strategic Air Command, which formed part of the United States nuclear strike capability. Together with land-launched and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, the B-52, with its impressive capabilities as a nuclear weapons delivery system, completed what was known as the nuclear triad. However, de-escalating tensions between Russia and the United States, following the end of the Cold War, have reduced the need for B-52 bombers on constant alert. The Strategic Air Command has been disbanded, and the 325th Bomb Squadron, which now forms part of the United States Air Force, is to be deactivated. Many of the Bomb Squadron's personnel have already departed the base for other postings. This is likely to be the last display of the B-52 at Fairchild Air Force Base. This afternoon, the B-52, with call sign Czar 52, is commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Bud Holland, aged 46, with 5,725 hours of flight experience. Almost all of these have been at the controls of the B-52. Bud Holland is a widely respected pilot, considered by his superiors to be amongst the best B-52 pilots in the United States Air Force. As well as his flying duties, Holland also holds a position as Chief of Standardization and Evaluation, responsible for ensuring adherence to U.S. Air Force regulations, especially in respect of the B-52. This is Holland's 3rd airshow at Fairchild, having flown similar patterns 3 years previously. 3 other field-grade officers are aboard. Holland's co-pilot is the leader of the 325th Bomb Squadron, Lieutenant Colonel Mark McGeehan, age 38. As well as being the squadron commander, Holland is also an experienced pilot in his own right. Acting as navigator on the demonstration flight is Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Huston, aged 41. A senior radar navigator who is also the 325th Bomb Squadron's operations officer. Finally, the last member in the cockpit is Colonel Robert Wolfe, aged 46. Colonel Wolfe is the Vice Wing Commander, second only in authority to the Wing Commander himself. He has been added to the flight as a safety observer Sitting in the cockpit's jump seat, he will review the demonstration and Lieutenant Colonel Holland's flying to ensure it is safe before the airshow. There is another motive for Wolf's presence. The wing commander has arranged that the flight be what is known as Wolf's Finney flight, his last operational flight as a B-52 crew member. Unknown to him, his family and colleagues are gathered to watch the demonstration, with a surprise celebration to be held after he lands to commemorate a successful flying career. At just before 2 p.m, the 8-engine B-52 lines up and roars down the runway. Carrying no payload, Czar 52 quickly climbs into the clear sky and immediately begins its demonstration, starting with a 360-degree climbing turn around the control tower. Having gained altitude, Lieutenant Colonel Holland turns the aircraft and conducts a fly-pass down the runway in the opposite direction he has taken off from, performing a low-speed pass at less than 500 feet above the ground. The B-52 then turns 180 degrees and begins to fly down the runway once again. Midway down the runway, Holland increases the throttle, pulls the nose of the aircraft up, and executes an almost vertical climb. Czar 52 climbs 8,000 feet in about 25 seconds, performing more like a fighter jet than a heavy bomber. Immediately after leveling off from the climb, Holland puts the B-52 into a descent and passes the crowd. The next planned maneuver is a landing demonstration, where the aircraft passes the crowd low and slow with its landing gear extended. After completing the maneuver, Holland comes around for another low and slow pass, only 200 feet above the ground. After this pass, Holland banks the aircraft to almost 80 degrees and initiates a steep climbing turn. This final climbing maneuver completes the demonstration. Holland sets the B-52 up to land on runway 23, where it had taken off from. As Czar 52 is preparing to land, the KC-135 fuel tanker, which is still undertaking part of its demonstration, is on the runway performing a touch and go. A touch and go is a maneuver where the aircraft touches down on the runway and immediately takes off again. To avoid colliding with the KC-135 on the runway, Holland initiates a go-around, aborting the landing, applying full throttle, and climbing away. Lieutenant Colonel Holland requests permission from the base air traffic control to perform a 360-degree climbing turn around the tower, much in the same way as he had taken off. Before the tower can give permission, the B-52 retracts its landing gear and turns steeply to the left while climbing. Holland turns the aircraft sharply so that the aircraft is banked more than 60 degrees to the left. So sharply, in fact, that the aircraft begins to drop as it struggles to maintain altitude. To counter this, Holland reduces the angle of bank to 45 degrees and continues the turn. About 2/3 of the way through the turn, Holland again steepens the angle of bank to 60 degrees. Suddenly, the nose of the aircraft drops, and simultaneously the aircraft tips onto its side. The gathered crowd watch in horror as the B-52 begins to fall from only a few hundred feet above the ground. Part of the cockpit can be seen being jettisoned from the aircraft as one of the flight crew begins the process of ejecting. The left wing clips a power line with a flash before Czar 52 hits the ground. Instantly, the aircraft disintegrates and bursts into flames. A fireball, consuming the entire aircraft, reaches hundreds of feet into the air. Shouting and screaming can be heard from the crowd watching the demonstration. Rescue vehicles on standby during the practice immediately make their way to the crash site, which is within the airfield compound. Within 60 seconds, the first firefighting equipment is on the scene. The only recognizable parts of the aircraft after its impact are the fuselage and the left horizontal stabilizer. The fire crews work to extinguish the flames and the grass fires which had taken hold as a consequence of the crash. Once the fire is under control, the rescue teams begin scouring the crash site for any survivors. There is hope that at least one member of the crew might have survived the impact, since many witnesses reported a canopy being jettisoned from the aircraft. The B-52 is equipped with 6 ejection seats, 4 which eject upwards, and 2 which actually eject from the bottom of the aircraft. Both Lieutenant Colonel Holland and Lieutenant Colonel Mark McGeehan, who were in the cockpit and co-pilot seat respectively, had ejection seats. Colonel Robert Wolfe, who had been sitting in the B-52's cockpit jump seat, did not have the opportunity to eject. Lieutenant Colonel Huston, who was sitting in the radar navigator's position, also had an ejection seat which ejected downwards. However, as the rescuers combed the crash site, they come across 4 bodies. The 4 field-grade officers, Holland, McGeehan, Huston, and Wolfe, are dead. Because the crash of Czar 52 at Fairchild Air Force Base involved a military aircraft, it was not within the American National Transportation Safety Board's jurisdiction to investigate. The NTSB is only obliged to investigate aviation accidents which either involve a civilian aircraft or a military and civilian aircraft in the same incident. Where requested by the military, the NTSB will assist investigating in military accidents. Instead, the United States Air Force immediately formed a board of investigation made up of Air Force personnel to determine what had happened. Unlike many civilian airliner accidents, there were many witnesses to the Fairchild B-52 crash. There were also numerous photographs and even videos of the incident and the aircraft's final moments. What the investigators did not have was a digital flight data recorder or a cockpit voice recorder. The B-52, as a military aircraft, is not required to carry either. Instead, investigators would need to use other sources, such as witnesses to the accident, including the video footage, weather conditions, and the wreckage. Since many of the witnesses to the accident were pilots of the B-52 themselves, or experienced Air Force personnel, they were able to provide detailed information during their interviews to assist with the investigation. Their immediate view was that the aircraft had entered into a stall. As discussed in earlier episodes, a stall is a situation in which the lift generated by an aircraft's wing will rapidly decrease once the wing goes past a critical angle relative to the flow of air. Aircraft are typically described as having a stall speed. This is the speed at which the aircraft will stall when it is flying straight and level. As the aircraft's speed decreases, it will need to pitch its nose further and further up to maintain the same altitude. Eventually, the aircraft reaches a point where the wing can no longer generate sufficient lift, and it will drop. In reality, an aircraft can stall at any speed, not just the stall speed. The speed at which the aircraft will stall is determined by a number of factors, including the weight of the aircraft, the density of the air the aircraft is flying in, and in the case of Czar 52, the angle of bank the aircraft is flying at. As an aircraft banks, the direction of lift generated by the wing changes from acting directly upwards to acting at an angle. This means there is less lift force acting upwards, since a component of that lift is now working horizontally. So when banked, for any given airspeed, the aircraft's wing is generating less lift than it would be if it was flying straight and level. This means that the stall speed of the aircraft becomes higher as the aircraft is banking. This is known as an accelerated stall. To maintain the same altitude during a turn, an aircraft needs to generate more lift, otherwise it will descend. This can be achieved by either pitching the nose up or increasing engine power. The B-52's stall speed is quoted in the aircraft's flight manual as 110 knots indicated airspeed. In a 30-degree turn, which is a fairly standard turn for the B-52, the stall speed increases by only 7 knots to 117 knots. However, If the aircraft is flying with a 60-degree bank angle, that stall speed increases to 145 knots. There is no data on the stall speed for the bank angles at which Holland was flying the aircraft, since it was not conceived that the aircraft would ever be flown in this way. But suffice it to say, the stall speed of the B52 increases exponentially as bank angle increases. To counter these effects and increased lift, Holland did increase the power of the B-52's 8 engines, as many saw the smoke generated by the engines begin to increase. Unfortunately, the engines on the B-52 take up to 8 seconds to spool up and deliver the thrust required to maintain the aircraft's altitude. The investigators therefore believe that Holland had inadvertently entered into an accelerated stall. Once he had entered the stall, he did not take any actions to break out of it. It is likely the pilots did not realize the B-52 had stalled before it was too late. Some witnesses believed that some of the B-52's 8 engines might have failed, and Holland had stalled the aircraft because of this reduced thrust. However, a thorough examination of the aircraft's engines and instruments indicated that all were operating at the time of impact. The investigators also considered the wind, which had affected the aircraft during its final moments. As the B-52 was preparing to land, it was facing 229 degrees. The wind was blowing from 207 degrees at a speed of 10 knots, so the aircraft was flying into a headwind. A headwind is a wind which blows opposite the direction of travel. This is favourable for takeoffs and landings, because it means the aircraft does not have to be travelling so fast relative to the ground in order to take off and land. For example, the desired speed when landing the B-52 is about 175 knots. But if the B-52 is flying directly into a wind of 10 knots, the actual ground speed of the aircraft only needs to be 165 knots. The remaining 10-knot component is made up by the headwind. Unfortunately, as Holland commenced the go-around by performing the 360-degree turn around the tower, the direction of the aircraft changed relative to the wind. First, the aircraft experienced a crosswind, a situation in which wind blows against the side of the aircraft. But as Holland continued to turn the B-52, the crosswind then became a tailwind. The wind, which was initially helping keep the aircraft airborne at the start of the turn, is no longer providing any additional lift. The investigators believe that this drop in lift, which was essentially a slowly developing wind shear, may have contributed to the accident. When Holland was flying right on the edge of the aircraft's performance envelope, the 10-knot wind could well have made the difference between flying and stalling. With regard to the pilot ejection, which witnesses had claimed to see, the investigators concluded that it was Lieutenant Colonel McGeehan who had initiated the ejection sequence, but no other crew members who were capable of ejecting attempted it. The ejection sequence on the B-52 is initiated by lifting the seat's armrests and turning an arming handle. Once this is done, the pilot's harnesses lock in position, and a thruster fires which forces the control column forward so the pilot does not hit it while ejecting. A second thruster causes the canopy above the pilot to be jettisoned. The next step is for the pilot to pull a trigger, which finally causes the seat to be ejected from the aircraft. McGeehan was well below the minimum altitude required for an ejection to be effective. The pilots of the aircraft needed to be 400 feet above the ground in order for the ejection to be successful, and the radar navigator, Huston, required 520 feet in order to eject downwards. The investigators believed that the ejection sequence had started, but the aircraft impacted the ground before McGeehan could successfully exit the aircraft. It is likely that Huston, who was sitting on the lower deck and facing rearwards in the navigator's position, was not aware of what was happening until it was far too late. So, the investigators knew the series of events which had unfolded in front of the crowd on the 24th of June 1994. At face value, the crash appeared to be an unfortunate accident. A case where a very experienced pilot made a mistake at an altitude where there was no margin for error, in an otherwise exemplary demonstration of the aircraft's abilities. The reality is far more complicated. The truth is that the demonstration which Holland flew on that day was incredibly unsafe and broke a large number of US Air Force regulations, and his supervisors watched it happen. The 1994 Fairchild B52 crash was the culmination of a series of events which had begun years before. To understand how the 1994 Fairchild Air Force crash occurred, we have to understand Arthur "Bud" Holland and the environment he came to operate in. Arthur Holland began his aviation career in the United States Air Force in March 1971 and had flown the B-52 almost exclusively. He possessed thousands of hours of flight experience and was without question a gifted pilot. As the head of the Standardization and Evaluation Board for the 92nd Bomb Wing, he was in a position of respect as somebody whose job it was to uphold the regulations associated with operating the B-52. To his superiors, he appeared to be an exemplary and model pilot. However, the investigators discovered that laterally in his career there had been a series of incidents which had led some of the aircrew in the 325th Bomb Squadron to question Holland's decision-making and caused some of them to refuse to fly with him. The following is a list of events which led up to the crash of Czar 52 in June of 1994. Incident 1, 1991 Fairchild Airshow. On the 19th of May, 1991, Bud Holland commanded the B-52 for the Fairchild Airshow. During this display, Holland performed a number of turning and climbing maneuvers which were well in excess of what was considered safe. The operational limits of what the B-52 is capable of are recorded in the aircraft's flight manual, known by Air Force personnel as the -11. The angles of bank Holland employed were in the region of 45 degrees. While the B-52 is capable of operating at these angles of bank, the aircraft was not permitted to bank further than 30 degrees during operations close to the runway. Before, during, or after the demonstration, none of Holland's superiors made any comment about the pattern that was flown. At the time, the 92nd Bomb Wing was led by Colonel Weinman, who was supported by Colonel Ulich as operations commander, who led the 92nd Operations Group, which was the flying component of the 92nd Bomb Wing. Both leaders were experienced B-52 pilots, who personally observed the demonstration. Even though they were well aware of the operational capabilities of the B-52 and the requirements within the -11 manual, they did not take any disciplinary action against Bud Holland. Incident 2, 1991 Change of Command Ceremony. 2 months later, on the 12th of July 1991, Holland flew as part of a ceremony to commemorate the change of command of the 325th Bomb Squadron. During this ceremony, as most of the aircrew stood at attention on the ground, Holland conducted flypasts as low as 100 to 200 feet above the ground. Colonel Weinman disapproved of the low-altitude passes and is believed to have verbally reprimanded Holland for the display later, stating it was unsafe and set a very poor example for other, younger pilots. But there was no formal documentation of this disciplinary action, and no record kept. The extent of Holland's punishment was the verbal reprimand. Weinman would leave his role a few months later, leaving no record of the reprimand, and leaving Holland free to fly in the same way again. Incident 3, 1992 Fairchild Airshow. On the 17th of May 1992, Holland was again the B-52 demonstration pilot at the Fairchild Airshow. In addition to the very steep turns, Holland now added a high-speed pass down the runway. Much in the same way as he would perform in 1994, Holland executed a steep climb of about 60 degrees halfway down the runway. After climbing, he leveled the aircraft off using a technique known as a wing-over. He effectively rolled the aircraft onto its side in order to bring the nose down and regain level flight. Following the demonstration, the new deputy commander for operations, Colonel Capitosti, who had replaced Ulich, finally took action and spoke to Holland. He stated that as long as he was deputy commander for operations, Holland would never fly another airshow. He also told Holland that if he violated any further flying regulations, he would be grounded permanently. Again, no formal reprimand was recorded on Holland's record, only a discussion was held. The threat made by Capitosti likely seemed empty after Holland had already been reprimanded the year before and was now being told the same thing again. Incident 4, 1993 Global Power Mission. On the 14th and 15th of April, Holland commanded a B52 in what is known as a Global Power Mission. This is a training exercise for aircrew to practice long-range bombing missions. In this exercise, Holland and another aircraft from the Fairchild Air Force Base flew to a chain of islands near Guam to drop live munitions. During the flight, Holland maneuvered his B-52 and encouraged the other bomber to get in a wingtip-to-wingtip formation in order to get photographs of the other aircraft undertaking the bombing mission. Holland used the pretense that he had been instructed by the wing commander to get good photographs, whatever it took. At the time the bombs were to be dropped, Holland permitted one of the flight crew to move out into the bomb bay and take pictures of bombs as they were leaving the aircraft. All senior personnel at the Air Force Base denied having seen this footage or knowing about this incident, but some pilots claimed that the leadership either covered up the video of the incident or refused to watch it. No formal reprimand was made against Bud Holland for these actions. Incident 5, 1993 Fairchild Airshow. Colonel Capitosti's claim that Holland would never fly an airshow while he was Deputy Commander of Operations was correct. By the 8th of August 1993, Capitosti had departed Fairchild and had been replaced by Colonel Pellerin, so Holland was once again free to fly the Fairchild Airshow. Holland again flew a pattern that violated the -11 flight manual, flying at extreme bank angles, performing low-altitude passes, and initiating high angles of climb. This time, the aircraft's angle of climb was estimated at 80 degrees, 10 degrees shy of climbing vertically. One witness reported fuel flowing from the vents on the wings because of the extreme angle of climb. The new 92nd Bomb Wing commander, Colonel Richards, stated he looked to his deputy commander for operations, Colonel Pellerin, to determine whether the airshow met regulations. Pellerin, in turn, stated that he relied on Holland to ensure the demonstration met with regulations. There was no reprimand for Holland's actions on this flight. In fact, it is unsure if any of Holland's superiors even realized anything had been done wrong. Holland had again gotten away with violating regulations. It is worth noting at this point that although Holland's actions may not have been catching the attention of senior leadership at Fairchild Air Force Base, that is not to say the actions were not being noticed. On the contrary, the personnel who were required to fly with Holland during the events described above would witness Holland breaking the rules and report back to their fellow crew members what they had experienced. The consensus among the flight crew was an increasing level of disbelief. Disbelief that Holland was allowed to get away with performing maneuvers that clearly contravened the regulations he was supposed to uphold as the Chief of Standardization and Evaluation. But as well as this disbelief, there was a growing sense of unease about the prospect of flying with Holland. This would be magnified in the next incident. Incident 6, Yakima Bombing Range. Tensions came to a head on the 10th of March 1994. Bud Holland and his crew were tasked with dropping live munitions at a bombing range and providing a photo opportunity for an authorized photographer taking pictures for a book. After dropping the payload, Holland maneuvered the B-52 to fly over the ridge the photographers were operating from. He made a number of passes, flying lower each time until the aircraft was barely clearing the ridgeline. One of the witnesses believed that the B-52 cleared the ridge with only 3 feet to spare. Eventually, the photographers actually abandoned the photo shoot since they were certain the B-52 was going to impact the ridge. The co-pilot of the aircraft claimed that had he not intervened and forcefully pulled the nose of the aircraft up while Holland was flying, that the B-52 would have impacted the ridge. The radar operator and navigator of the aircraft were shouting at Holland that there was no need to fly this low. Witnesses report Holland laughing at this incident and calling the navigator a pussy. After returning to Fairchild, and after privately discussing the events, the flight crew agreed to go to their commanding officer to state that they no longer wished to fly with Bud Holland. It is at this point that Mark McGeehan enters the picture. Mark McGeehan was made leader of the 325th Bomb Squadron, which sat under the 92nd Operations Group, towards the beginning of 1994. After the incident at the Yakima bombing range, which had been videotaped, a number of pilots came to Mark McGeehan, stating that they no longer wished to fly with Holland. As Holland's commanding officer, McGeehan made the decision to finally ground him. While McGeehan had the authority to ground Holland himself, because Holland was head of standardization and evaluation for the 92nd Bomb Wing, McGeehan decided he would need permission from the head of the 92nd Operations Group, Colonel Pellerin, before he could ground Holland. McGeehan approached Pellerin and laid out the facts as he saw them, recommending that Holland be grounded. Pellerin thanked him and told him he would consider this recommendation. Pellerin then spoke to Holland in private about his behaviour. Holland stated that he was just trying to demonstrate the capabilities of the aircraft to more junior pilots. Pellerin verbally reprimanded Holland for this behaviour. He then called McGeehan and Holland into the same meeting, where he informed McGeehan that he'd made a decision. Holland would not be grounded. At that same meeting, McGeehan made Pellerin aware of the events that had transpired at the Yakima bombing range. Holland's excuse was that he was trying to demonstrate the ability of the aircraft to fly below clearance planes in particular circumstances. While Pellerin considered Holland's actions to be a breach of discipline, the only punishment Holland received was a verbal reprimand. Bud Holland assured Pellerin he would not violate any further air regulations. Following this meeting, Lieutenant Colonel Mark McGeehan came to a decision. He decided that he would personally fly with Bud Holland every time that Holland flew, in order to avoid exposing younger pilots to Holland's airmanship. Now, two men, one who had openly criticized the other, would be flying together in the same aircraft regularly. There were several witnesses who claimed that there was a significant level of animosity between the two pilots after this interaction. What was more, the decision on the pilot chosen to fly the B-52 at the 1994 Fairchild Airshow had been made. It would be Bud Holland. On the 15th of June, 9 days before the incident, a briefing session was held on the planned airshow profile. In attendance was the commander of the 92nd Bomb Wing, Colonel Brooks. Also present was Colonel Pellerin, Lieutenant Colonel Holland, and Lieutenant Colonel Mark McGeehan. The profile which Holland presented was much the same as the previous year, but with one addition: a climbing 360-degree turn around the control tower. Brooks ordered that angles of bank would be no greater than 45 degrees, and angles of climb would be no greater than 25 degrees. The first airshow practice was held on the 17th of June. In the aircraft was Holland as commander, McGeehan as co-pilot, Pellerin in the cockpit jump seat, and Huston as navigator. Despite being fairly senior, Huston was present because his subordinate refused to fly with Holland anymore. As ranking navigator, Huston was required to fill the position. The demonstration that was flown was not as extreme as the one which would be flown on the 24th of June, perhaps because Pellerin was present in the aircraft. However, the profile still broke all regulations in regard to angles of climb and angles of bank. Despite this, Pellerin would report that the flight profile was well within parameters and was totally safe. One final practice before the show was to be held. On the 24th of June 1994, Pellerin was the only member of the United States Air Force who is known to have been punished for the crash of Czar 52. He faced a court-martial for 2 counts of dereliction of duty, to which he pleaded guilty. His punishment was the forfeiture of $1,500 per month salary for 5 months. There is no record of any other punishment being levied against any of the previous commanders of Fairchild Air Force Base. Holland essentially acted above the rules he was supposed to enforce, without reprimand. The disaster at Fairchild Air Force Base in June of 1994 emphasizes the importance of not only creating regulations, but enforcing them, and being seen to enforce them. Mark McGeehan saved one of his subordinates from being aboard when Holland's airmanship finally caught up with him. McGeehan's family would watch from the garden in their home as the disaster unfolded in front of them. The situation where Mark McGeehan had to put himself in danger to protect his men from one of their own colleagues should never have needed to happen. Today, the Fairchild B52 crash is used in both military and civilian settings to emphasize the importance of following regulations and the culture which can be created without enforcing them. Thank you for listening to Inside the Black Box. Please follow the Inside the Black Box podcast on Twitter at ITBB Podcast. That's India Tango Bravo Bravo Podcast. Thank you.